The house at 88 Briar Ridge Road had been empty for 91 years. Not because the roof had caved in. Not because the foundation had crumbled. The floors were solid. The walls still stood. The chimney rose tall and straight against the Appalachian sky, like a gravestone marking something buried underneath. No. The house was empty because the entire town of Ashford Hollow, West Virginia, was terrified of what was sealed inside it. So they sold it. $12,800. Cash only. No inspections. No questions. Claire Whitfield was 27 years old, drowning in debt, and 30 days from being thrown out of her apartment in Portland when she found the listing. She thought she was buying a second chance, a fresh start, a roof that belonged to her. She was wrong. What she actually bought was a dead man's vault, a missing woman's diary, and 91 years of secrets that an entire town had killed to keep buried. They told her not to measure the walls. She measured them anyway. They told her not to go into the basement. She went anyway. They told her to leave Ashford Hollow and never come back. Instead, she grabbed a sledgehammer. This is the story of the cheapest house in the state and the woman who cracked it open. They were out of time. Claire Whitfield knew this the way you know a storm is coming before the sky turns. Not because someone told her. Not because she read it somewhere. She knew it in her chest, that low hum of dread that settles in when the math stops working and the walls start closing in. 30 days. That was what the letter said. 30 days to vacate the apartment on Southeast Division Street in Portland, Oregon. The letter was printed on cream-colored paper with the law firm's name embossed at the top, and it sat on the kitchen counter like a small grenade no one wanted to touch. Claire picked it up for the 4th time that morning. She read it again, even though she had already memorized every word. The language was polite, legal, sterile, but underneath the formality was a simple, brutal truth. You can no longer afford to live here. Get out. She set the letter down and looked around the apartment. 600 square feet, a bathroom where the shower leaked brown water every 3rd Tuesday, a bedroom window that faced a brick wall 4 feet away, a kitchen so narrow that she and Garrett couldn't stand in it at the same time without touching shoulders. They paid $1,900 a month for this, and even that had become impossible. Claire was 27 years old. She was a freelance graphic designer, which sounded impressive at dinner parties. But in practice, meant she spent her days chasing invoices from clients who treated payment like a suggestion. Her biggest contract, a branding project for a mid-sized tech company in Beaverton, had evaporated 6 weeks ago when the company laid off half its staff and froze all vendor payments. Just like that. One email, one line. We regret to inform you that your contract has been terminated effective immediately. She had stared at that email for 11 minutes. She knew because she had been sitting in front of her laptop cursor blinking coffee going cold. And when she finally looked at the clock, 11 minutes had passed without her breathing. Garrett Whitfield. Her husband of 2 years was a high school history teacher at Franklin High. He made $41,000 a year before taxes. After taxes, after his student loan payments, after health insurance, after the monthly minimum on 2 credit cards, they should never have opened his take-home pay, covered roughly 60% of their rent. Claire's freelance income was supposed to cover the rest, and for a while it did. Barely. Painfully. But it did. Now it didn't. The student loans alone were a slow bleeding wound. Garrett had a master's degree in American history from Portland State, which he had pursued with the earnest optimism of a man who believed that education was its own reward. And it was. The reward was $112,000 in debt and a job that paid less than the assistant manager at the Target on Northeast Sandy. Claire had no degree. She had dropped out of community college at 19 to take care of her mother during the final stages of lung cancer. After her mother died, Claire taught herself graphic design from YouTube tutorials and library books. She was good at it, legitimately talented, but talent without a credential was invisible in a market that sorted people by diplomas. So here they were. 2 people who had done everything they were supposed to do, everything they were told would lead to stability, and they were standing in a 600-square-foot apartment, reading an eviction notice. Garrett came out of the bedroom that evening, wearing a rumpled button-down and the expression of a man who had just spent 8 hours teaching the Civil War to teenagers who were watching TikTok under their desks. He saw the letter on the counter. He didn't pick it up. "We'll figure it out," he said. He had been saying that for 3 months. Claire loved him for it. She also wanted to scream every time he said it because figuring it out required a plan, and they didn't have one. They had hope, and hope, Claire had learned, was just a word people used when they couldn't afford a solution. She didn't scream. She sat down at her laptop and opened a browser tab she had been keeping hidden for 2 weeks. A distressed property website. Foreclosures, tax liens, bank-owned lots. The bottom of the American real estate market, where desperation met opportunity, and sometimes, very rarely, a miracle fell through the cracks. Claire had been scrolling these listings every night after Garrett went to sleep. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. A sign, maybe. A door that hadn't been closed yet. On that particular Tuesday at 11:47 at night, she found it. The listing was buried on page 19, sandwiched between an empty lot in rural Ohio and a condemned duplex in Wheeling. The photograph was small, grainy, clearly taken with an old camera or a cheap phone. But even through the poor quality, the image stopped her cold. It was a house. A real house. Not a shack, not a trailer, not an empty slab of concrete. A massive craftsman-style home with a wraparound porch stone chimney and tall windows framed by overgrown weeping willows. The kind of house that belonged on the cover of a magazine about places people used to live when America still built things to last. 88 Briar Ridge Road, Ashford Hollow, West Virginia. 4 bedrooms, 1.5 bathrooms, 3 acres of land, built in 1912. Price, $12,800. Claire took off her glasses, cleaned them on the hem of her shirt, and put them back on. She read the number again. She read it a third time. $12,800. That was less than 7 months of rent on their Portland apartment. That was less than Garrett's remaining car payment. That was less than the cost of the root canal she had been putting off for a year. There had to be a catch. There was always a catch. She scrolled down to the description. Property sold strictly as is. Cash buyers only. No inspections permitted prior to closing. Estate sale. All inquiries to Judith Crane County Realty. Claire read those lines 5 times. No inspections permitted. That was the catch, or at least it was the visible one. You don't sell a 4-bedroom house on 3 acres for $12,000 unless something was profoundly wrong. Fire damage, black mold, structural failure. Maybe the land was contaminated. Maybe the house was sitting on top of a collapsed mine shaft, which wasn't uncommon in West Virginia coal country. But the photograph. Claire kept coming back to the photograph. The chimney was intact. The porch sagged on one side, but the stone foundation looked thick and solid, the kind of hand-cut masonry that didn't fail. The roof line was straight. The windows were dark but unbroken. She zoomed in. She studied the tree line behind the house, the angle of the driveway, the condition of the visible stonework. These were the instincts of a woman who had grown up in cheap rentals in apartments where the landlord never fixed anything, where she had learned before she was 12 years old to check the walls for soft spots, to listen for the sound of water behind plaster, to trust her hands more than her eyes. This house was neglected, abandoned, but it didn't look destroyed. Her heart was beating faster than it should have been. She knew she was being irrational.
She knew this was exactly how people made catastrophic financial decisions, by wanting something so badly that they stopped seeing the risk. But $12,800. She closed the laptop, opened it, closed it again. Then she called out to the bedroom. Garrett! He appeared in the doorway, half asleep, toothbrush hanging from his mouth. Come look at this.
He leaned over her shoulder. She watched his face as he read the listing. His brow furrowed. His jaw tightened. He was quiet for a long time. It's a teardown, he finally said. Has to be, or it's on a sinkhole. Or there's a lien the listing isn't disclosing. It says no liens. They always say no liens. He paused. His eyes lingered on the chimney and the photograph on the stonework. He was a history teacher. He couldn't help himself. He recognized craftsmanship when he saw it, even through a grainy photo. 1912 construction. That's pre-war masonry. They built different back then. I know. Claire, we have $11,000 in savings. That's everything we have. Every dollar. I know. If we spend it on a collapsing house in West Virginia, we have nothing. No safety net, no backup plan. Garrett. She turned to look at him. We don't have a backup plan now. We have 30 days and an eviction notice. What exactly are we saving the money for? He didn't answer. He stared at the screen for a long time. Then he pulled the toothbrush from his mouth and said very quietly, "Call the agent in the morning." Claire called at 8:15 the next day. The number listed for Crane County Realty rang 6 times before a woman answered. Her voice was brisk, professional, and carried the faint Appalachian lilt of someone who had grown up in the hills but had spent years trying to smooth the edges off her accent. "Crane County Realty, this is Judith." "Hi, I'm calling about the listing on Briar Ridge Road, 88 Briar Ridge." There was a pause. Not a long one, maybe 2 seconds, but Claire noticed it. She noticed everything. "The Blackwood property?" Judith said. There was something in her voice now. Not surprise exactly. More like a door opening that she hadn't expected anyone to knock on. "Are you folks from around here?" "No, we're in Portland, Oregon." "Oregon." Another pause. "What do you do for a living, if you don't mind my asking, you and your husband?" The question struck Claire as odd. Real estate agents ask about financing. They ask about timelines. They don't usually ask what you do for a living before they've even described the property. But Claire answered anyway. "I'm a graphic designer, freelance. My husband teaches high school history." "History?" Judith repeated, and Claire could have sworn she heard something shift in the woman's tone. Interest or calculation. It was hard to tell. "Well, the Blackwood place has plenty of that." "Why is the price so low?" Claire asked directly. She didn't have the patience or the luxury for small talk. $12,000 for a 4-bedroom on 3 acres. What's wrong with it?" "Nothing's wrong with it that time hasn't done to every old house in this county. No liens, no hazmat flags on record. It's an estate sale. The last owner's heirs want it off their hands. It's been sitting empty for a long time." "How long?" "Since 1934. Claire pulled the phone away from her ear and stared at it. Then she brought it back. 91 years. That's correct. And nobody's bought it in 91 years. It's a small town. Not a lot of demand for old houses out here. Judith's voice was smooth, practiced. But Claire heard the thing underneath it, the careful steering, the way Judith was answering every question without really telling her anything. "If you're serious, you're welcome to come see it. I can meet you there with the key." "We'll be there in 3 days, Claire said. "One more thing," Judith added, and her voice dropped just slightly. "I can show you the outside. I can let you in. But I want you to understand, I don't go inside with clients on this property. You'll be looking at it on your own." Claire felt the hair on her arms stand up. It was a small thing, that sentence, delivered casually, almost as an afterthought. But it was the most honest thing Judith Crane had said in the entire conversation. "Why not? It's just policy. Old house liability concerns. You know how it is." Claire didn't know how it was, but she said thank you and hung up. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at the photograph on her laptop screen. The dark windows, the sagging porch. the chimney rising like a finger pointing at something no one wanted to look at. She should have walked away. Every rational instinct she had was screaming at her to close the laptop, throw the eviction notice in the trash, and start looking for a cheaper apartment somewhere in the Portland sprawl. But Claire Whitfield had spent her entire life being rational. She had been rational when she dropped out of college. Rational when she nursed her dying mother. Rational when she married a man she loved, knowing they would struggle. Rational when she chased invoices and swallowed her pride and made do with less every single month. Being rational had gotten her to this exact point. Broke, evicted, running out of road. Maybe it was time to be something else. They packed the Honda Civic on a Saturday morning. Everything they couldn't fit in the car they left. The furniture belonged to the landlord anyway. Their clothes, Claire's laptop, Garrett's box of history books, a toolkit, sleeping bags. It all fit in the trunk and the back seat with room to spare, which said something about how little they had accumulated in 27 years of life. The drive from Portland to West Virginia took 4 days. They slept in the car twice and at a Motel 6 in Nebraska once. They split gas station sandwiches and drank truck stop coffee so bitter it could strip paint. They didn't talk much. There wasn't much to say. They had made the decision. Now they were living inside it. West Virginia announced itself gradually. The flat sprawl of the Midwest gave way to rolling green hills, then to sharper ridges, then to mountains that closed around the highway like the walls of a narrowing hallway. The trees thickened. The sky shrank. Ashford Hollow was not on any map that mattered. The GPS gave up 2 miles before they reached it, the screen showing nothing but a gray void with a thin line of road running through it. They found the town by following a county road that wound through dense, shadowy woods, where the canopy was so thick the sunlight hit the asphalt in scattered coins. The town itself was a single main street held together by habit and stubbornness. A diner with a hand-painted sign that read, Laureen's. A hardware store with a window display that hadn't been changed since the Reagan administration. A gas station with 2 pumps, both rusted, and a handwritten sign taped to one of them that said, Pay inside, no cards. Claire counted 7 occupied storefronts and 14 boarded up ones. The ratio told her everything she needed to know. This was a town that was dying and knew it. Briar Ridge Road was 3 miles past the last house on Main Street, winding through woods so dense and quiet that Claire felt the silence pressing against the car windows like a physical weight. The trees were old-growth massive oaks and poplars whose branches interlocked overhead, turning the road into a tunnel of green shadow. When they pulled into the gravel driveway of number 88, Claire turned off the engine and didn't move. The house stood before them at the end of a long, curving drive, framed by 2 enormous weeping willows, whose branches hung like curtains of pale green hair. In the photograph online, the house had looked large. In person, it was enormous. 3 stories, if you counted the attic dormers. A wraparound porch that extended along the entire front and left side. The stone chimney rose above the roofline, solid and straight, exactly as it had appeared in the listing photo. But the decay was breathtaking. The paint had peeled away in long gray ribbons, exposing the raw wood underneath to decades of rain and sun. The porch sagged heavily on the left side, the support posts tilting at angles that made Claire's stomach tighten. The windows were intact, but so caked with grime and dust that they looked like blind eyes. And yet, the foundation. Claire got out of the car and walked straight to the base of the house, ignoring everything else. She crouched down and ran her hand along the stonework. It was hand-cut. Each block fitted to the next with the precision of people who understood that a foundation was a promise. 113 years of Appalachian winters, and the stone hadn't shifted, hadn't cracked, hadn't settled. She pressed her palm flat against it. The stone was cold and solid and absolutely real. "It's good," she said quietly, more to herself than to Garrett. A sedan was idling at the far end of the driveway. Judith Crane stood beside it, arms crossed, wearing a navy blazer and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was mid-40s, sharp-featured, with the practiced posture of a woman who had spent her career convincing people to want things they weren't sure about. She handed Claire a heavy brass key on a rusted ring. Their fingers touched briefly, and Claire felt the woman's hand trembling. Just slightly. Just enough. "Front door's unlocked," Judith said. She glanced up at the second-floor windows, and Claire watched her eyes move across the darkened glass like someone scanning a room for an exit. "Take your time. Walk through everything. If you want to make an offer, call my office." "You're not coming in?" Claire asked. "Like I said on the phone, liability." Claire studied her face. Judith Crane was not a woman who was afraid of liability. Judith Crane was a woman who was afraid of something specific. Something behind those dust-caked windows, and she had been afraid of it long enough that the fear had become part of her. "Thank you," Claire said. Judith got into her sedan. She did not say good luck. She did not say welcome to Ashford Hollow. She put the car in drive and pulled down the gravel road at a speed that was just slightly too fast, her tires throwing up a spray of small stones. Claire and Garrett stood in the overgrown front yard alone, holding a brass key to a house that hadn't been occupied since Franklin Roosevelt was president. "Ready," Garrett said. "No," Claire said, and she walked up the porch steps. The front door was heavy oak, original to the house, swollen with moisture and age. It took both of them to push it open. The hinges screamed a sound so sharp and prolonged that it echoed through the empty rooms inside like a warning siren. The air hit them first. A thick, layered smell, damp wood, on the bottom old paper, and dust in the middle, and above it all, a sharp metallic staleness like a room full of old pennies. It was the smell of a place that had been sealed and forgotten, breathing its own air for nearly a century. Claire stepped inside. Her boots left prints in the dust on the hardwood floor. The dust was so thick it looked like gray snow. But beneath it, when she scuffed her foot sideways, the wood was intact, solid. The grain was tight and dark old-growth oak that they stopped milling 60 years ago. They walked through the first floor in silence. The parlor was enormous with 12-foot ceilings and crown molding that was so detailed, Claire had to stop and stare. A stone fireplace dominated the far wall, its mantel carved with a pattern of interlocking leaves. Sheet-covered furniture stood like ghosts throughout the room, draped in white cloth that had turned gray with age. The kitchen was primitive by modern standards. A wood-burning stove, a hand-pump sink, no dishwasher, no disposal. But the cabinetry was handmade, each drawer fitted with dovetailed joints so precise they still slid smoothly after a century. Claire opened every door. She checked every corner. She pressed her hands against every wall, feeling for softness, for moisture, for the telltale give of rotting framing. She found almost nothing. A soft spot near the kitchen window. Some water staining on the ceiling of the back hallway. Minor damage. Repairable. The house should have been destroyed. 91 years of abandonment in the wet Appalachian climate should have turned it into a pile of rotting wood and collapsed plaster. But someone had built this house the way cathedrals were built, with materials that were meant to outlast the builder, with care that bordered on obsession. The main staircase rose from the center of the first floor, curving gently upward with a banister of carved walnut. Claire ran her hand along it as they climbed. The wood was smooth, worn by hands that had gripped it a lifetime ago. The second floor had 4 bedrooms and a bathroom with a clawfoot tub so heavy it had cracked the tile beneath it. The rooms were large with tall windows that would have flooded them with light if the glass hadn't been opaque with grime. Sheet-covered beds. A rocking chair in the corner of the master bedroom positioned to face the window, as though someone had once sat there watching the road for something that never came. Claire stood in the center of the hallway and turned slowly, taking it all in. "This house is a masterpiece," she said. "It's incredible," Garrett agreed. But his voice was subdued, and Claire understood why. There was a heaviness to the place that had nothing to do with the architecture. The silence inside was too complete, too dense. It pressed against the eardrums, and despite the massive exterior of the house, the inside felt slightly claustrophobic. The hallways were a bit too narrow. The walls seemed unusually thick. It was subtle, the kind of thing you felt more than measured. To a couple desperate for a home, these were quirks. Old construction, old techniques, nothing more. They drove into town to sign the paperwork that afternoon. The office of Crane County Realty was a single room above the hardware store, furnished with a metal desk, 2 folding chairs, and a filing cabinet that looked like it had survived a flood. Judith Crane processed the sale with the efficient detachment of a woman filling a prescription. She didn't make small talk. She didn't congratulate them. She slid the deed across the desk pointed to the signature lines and waited with her pen hovering over her own line, like she wanted this over with. Claire signed her name and handed over a cashier's check for $12,800. It was everything they had. Every dollar from their savings account, leaving them with a checking balance of $314. The check sat on the desk between them. Claire stared at it. She had just traded their entire safety net for a house she had spent 45 minutes inside. A house that hadn't been lived in since before her grandparents were born. A house in a town where the real estate agent was afraid to walk through the front door. She looked at Garrett. He squeezed her hand under the desk. It was the only thing he could give her that didn't cost money. They were homeowners. The euphoria lasted exactly 22 minutes, which was how long it took them to drive from Judith's office to Laureen's diner on Main Street. The diner was everything Claire expected. Vinyl booths, patched with duct tape, a counter with stools that swiveled on squeaky bearings. The smell of burned coffee and bacon grease layered so deeply into the walls that it had become part of the architecture. A television mounted in the corner played local news with the sound off. The bell above the door jingled when they walked in. Conversations stopped. Not gradually, not the natural fade of people losing their train of thought. Stopped. Completely. Simultaneously, like someone had pressed a mute button. 7 people were in the diner. 5 older men in work jackets and flannels occupying 3 separate booths. A younger woman sitting alone at the counter with a cup of tea. And the waitress, a stout woman in her 60s with steel gray hair pulled back in a bun and a name tag that said Laureen. All 7 of them stared at Claire and Garrett with expressions that ranged from open curiosity to something harder to name. Not hostility, exactly. Something closer to pity. Laureen poured them coffee without being asked. Her hands were steady, but her smile was cautious. The smile of a woman who had learned that friendliness in a small town carried obligations. "You folks passing through." "Actually," Garrett said, and Claire could hear the excitement in his voice, the need to share their improbable good fortune with someone, anyone. "We just bought a house here, out on Briar Ridge Road, number 88. The diner went silent again. But this time, the silence was different. It had weight. It had texture. Claire felt it settle over the room like a heavy blanket pressing down on every surface. Laureen's coffee pot stopped in midair, hovering over Claire's cup. The stream of coffee thinned to a drip, then stopped entirely. "The Blackwood place." An old man in the corner booth spoke. He was perhaps 75 with deep-set eyes and hands that were scarred and knotted from decades of physical labor. He looked at them the way you look at a car wreck you're driving past, with horror, with the guilty relief that it wasn't you. "I guess that was the previous owner's name," Claire said carefully. She set her coffee cup down. The diner's silence was making her skin prickle, every nerve ending firing at once. "Is there something we should know?" Laureen set the coffee pot down slowly. She leaned forward across the counter, her face close enough that Claire could smell the spearmint gum she was chewing. "Honey," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room. Nobody has lived in that house since 1934, and there's a good reason for it. You should not have bought that place. You need to leave it alone. Before Claire could respond, Laureen turned and pushed through the swinging kitchen door. It swung shut behind her with a rubbery slap. The old men in the booths slowly turned their attention back to their cold food, their cold coffee, their silence. The conversation was over. The door was closed. Claire looked at Garrett. He was staring at his coffee cup like it might contain answers. Then a voice spoke from behind them, quiet, measured, old. Don't mind them. Claire turned on her stool. At the last booth by the window, sitting alone with a glass of water and a Bible, was a man who looked like he had been carved from the same stone as the mountains outside. He was ancient easily in his 90s, with white hair cropped close to his scalp and deep brown eyes that held a clarity unusual for his age. He wore a minister's collar under a dark wool cardigan. "Emmett Marsh," he said, and he tipped his head slightly, a gesture of courtesy from a generation that still practiced it. "I'm the pastor over at First Methodist, retired now but old habits." "Claire Whitfield," Claire said. "This is my husband Garrett." Emmett Marsh studied her face for a long moment, not with the fear that the others had shown, not with the pity, with something else entirely. Something that looked impossibly like hope. "You bought the house on Briar Ridge," he said. It wasn't a question. "We did." He nodded slowly. He picked up his glass of water and took a sip. His hand trembling slightly, though whether from age or emotion, Claire couldn't tell. "Come to the church on Sunday morning," he said. "Before services, 7 o'clock. I have something you need to see." "What kind of something?" Emmett Marsh set his glass down and looked at her with those clear, deep-set eyes. "The kind that's been waiting 91 years for someone brave enough to ask." Claire stared at him. The diner hummed with its forced, uncomfortable silence. The old men pretended to eat. Laureen stayed in the kitchen. The bell above the door didn't ring because nobody was coming in and nobody was leaving. "We'll be there," Claire said. Despite the warning at the diner, despite the silence that followed them out the door and down the sidewalk like a shadow, Claire refused to let fear override logic. They had a house. They had a deed with their names on it. They had a roof that didn't leak and a foundation that hadn't cracked. Whatever dark history the townspeople were projecting onto the Blackwood property, it was exactly that, history. And Claire Whitfield was not the kind of woman who ran from a building because of a story. They set up camp in the downstairs parlor that first night, sleeping on air mattresses surrounded by buckets, mops, and industrial cleaning supplies they had bought from the hardware store on Main Street. The store owner, a thin man with a pronounced stutter, had sold them everything they asked for without meeting their eyes. He did not ask what the supplies were for. He did not need to. The first 3 weeks were brutal. Claire and Garrett worked from dawn until their bodies gave out, which was usually around 11 at night. They tore up rotted carpeting that disintegrated in their hands, releasing clouds of dust so thick they wore bandanas over their faces. They scrubbed decades of nicotine and coal soot off the plaster walls, watching the original cream color emerge beneath the black-like skin under a bruise. They pulled down 6 layers of wallpaper in the parlor alone, each layer uglier than the last, a geological record of bad taste stretching back to the 1950s. The physical labor was punishing, but the house responded. Under the grime and neglect, the craftsmanship revealed itself, inch by inch. The hardwood floors, once cleaned and treated with linseed oil, glowed a deep honey amber. The crown molding, freed from decades of paint, showed carvings so intricate that Garrett spent an entire afternoon photographing them. The stone fireplace, scrubbed with wire brushes and vinegar, turned out to be made of native sandstone, each block hand-cut and fitted without mortar. Someone had built this house with love. That was the only word for it. Not just skill, not just knowledge, but the kind of love that pours itself into every joint and corner because the builder believes the work will outlast them. Claire felt it every time she pressed her hands against the walls. The house was alive beneath the dust. It had been waiting, but the deeper they dug into the renovation, the more the house's strange anatomy became impossible to ignore. It started in the second week. Claire was sitting cross-legged on the parlor floor with her sketchbook drafting a floor plan. As a graphic designer, spatial relationships were second nature to her. She had been mapping the rooms, measuring walls, sketching proportions when something began to nag at her. A discrepancy. Small at first, then impossible to dismiss. She measured the interior walls of the basement. Then she went outside and measured the exterior foundation. She did the math 3 times, sitting on the porch steps with a pencil and a calculator, checking and rechecking. Garrett. He came down from the second floor, shirtless, streaked with sweat and plaster dust. He had been patching a crack in the guest bedroom ceiling. "What's wrong?" "Look at this." She held up the sketchbook. Her drawings were precise, annotated with measurements in her neat, compact handwriting. "The exterior foundation on the north side is 47 feet long. I measured it 3 times, but the interior basement walls, including the utility room and the storage area, only add up to 36 feet. Garrett frowned. He took the sketchbook and studied her numbers. 11 feet missing, he said. That's not insulation. That's not wall thickness. Even with double stud framing, you're looking at maybe 8 inches per wall. 11 feet, Garrett. That's an entire room. A room that doesn't appear on any floor plan, doesn't have a door, and doesn't have a window. It's just gone, like it was swallowed." They went down to the basement together. Claire led the way, carrying the heavy-duty flashlight and the tape measure. The basement was a low-ceilinged space with a dirt floor in some sections and poured concrete in others. The concrete was clearly older, cracked in places, but still solid. The walls were stone, matching the foundation above. Claire walked to the north wall of the basement. She ran her hands along the surface, feeling every seam, every joint. And then she found it. The change was subtle. If she hadn't been looking for it, if she hadn't measured twice and done the math 3 times, she never would have noticed. But there, about 2/3 of the way along the north wall, the stone transitioned. The original foundation stones were rough-cut, irregular set with lime mortar that had yellowed with age. But a section roughly 11 feet wide was different. The stones were smoother, more uniform, and the mortar between them was a slightly different color, darker, newer though still very old. Someone had sealed off a section of the basement. They had matched the stone as closely as possible, but they hadn't been able to perfectly replicate the original mason's work. Claire pressed her ear against the wall. She knocked. Once, twice. The second knock echoed. Not against solid stone, against hollow space. "There's something behind this wall," she said. Garrett stared at her. Then he stared at the wall. "Claire, maybe we shouldn't. Remember what Lorene said? What if there's a reason it's sealed?" Claire turned to him. Her face was calm, but her eyes were burning with something he recognized. It was the same look she'd had in their Portland apartment the night she found the listing. The look of a woman who had decided. "I grew up in apartments where the landlord sealed off rooms to hide black mold and code violations. If there's something wrong behind this wall, I need to know before we spend another dime on this house. Hand me the sledgehammer." She swung it herself. The first blow cracked the mortar between 2 stones. The second sent a chunk of stone clattering to the basement floor. The third opened a hole the size of a fist, and a rush of cold, stale air poured through, carrying a smell so distinct and layered that Claire instinctively stepped back. Old copper, dry earth, and something sharp and chemical like aged ink or turpentine. She shined the flashlight through the hole. Behind the false wall was not just dead space, not just forgotten plumbing or sealed-off rot. There was a staircase. Narrow, steep cut from raw stone descending into darkness below the level of the basement floor. A second basement. A sub-basement. A space that existed beneath the lowest level of the house, completely hidden, completely sealed, completely unknown to anyone who hadn't measured the walls with the obsessive precision of a woman who had learned to trust nothing at face value. Claire looked at Garrett. He was pale. She could see his pulse in his throat. "We go down," she said. "Claire, we go down. This is our house. Whatever is under it belongs to us." She widened the hole, swinging the sledgehammer until the opening was large enough to step through. Then she ducked through the gap, planted her boots on the top step of the hidden staircase, and began to descend into the dark. Garrett followed. He always followed. Not because he was weak, but because he had learned a long time ago that when Claire Whitfield decided to walk into the dark, the best thing you could do was make sure she wasn't walking alone. The staircase went down 14 steps. Claire counted each one. The air grew colder with every step, and the chemical smell intensified, mixing with the damp mineral scent of deep earth. At the bottom, the flashlight beam swept across a narrow stone corridor, perhaps 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall, extending forward into the blackness. And at the end of the corridor, maybe 20 feet ahead, the beam caught the dull gleam of metal. Something large. Something that did not belong in the basement of a house. Claire walked toward it. Sunday morning, 6:58. Claire stood on the steps of First Methodist Church while Garrett waited in the car with the engine running. Not because she'd asked him to wait, because she knew this conversation needed to happen between her and Emmett Marsh, without distraction, without anyone else's reactions to manage. The church was small white clapboard with a steeple that leaned 2 degrees to the east. The paint was fresh, though, and the steps were swept clean. Someone still cared about this building, even if the pews inside were mostly empty on Sundays. Emmett opened the door before she knocked. He was wearing the same dark cardigan, the same minister's collar. In his hands, he held a shoebox, the cardboard soft with age, held together with a rubber band that had lost most of its elasticity.
"You came," he said. "I told you I would."
He led her inside. The sanctuary was empty, lit by pale morning light, filtering through plain glass windows. No stained glass, no gold, just clean white walls and wooden pews worn smooth by decades of sitting and sitting again. They sat in the front pew. Emmett set the shoebox between them.
"Before I show you what's in here,"
he said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to understand that I've never told this to anyone in this town. Not because they don't know. They all know. But because none of them ever wanted to hear it said out loud." Claire waited. Emmett folded his hands in his lap. They were trembling again, and this time Claire knew it wasn't age. "I had a sister," he said. "Her name was Rose Marsh. She was 7 years older than me. I was 3 years old when she disappeared. October of 1933. I don't remember her face from life, only from the photograph my mother kept on the mantel. A girl with dark hair and a serious expression. 17 years old, strong, stubborn. The kind of girl who talked back to men twice her size." He paused. His eyes were fixed on the cross at the front of the sanctuary. "My parents told me she ran away, packed a bag in the middle of the night and left for the city. That's what they told everyone. That's what they made themselves believe, because the alternative was something they couldn't survive." "What was the alternative?" Claire asked softly. "That Silas Blackwood took her." The name hit the air like a stone dropping into still water. Claire felt the ripple of it the way the silence in the church seemed to deepen and harden around the syllables.
"Silas Blackwood owned the bank," Emmett continued. "He held the mortgages on every farm, every store, every home in Ashford Hollow. If you wanted a loan, you gave him leverage, dirt, secrets, and if you didn't have any to give, he found ways to create them. Forged documents, manufactured debts. He had a ledger, they said, a book of sins. Every family in this town was in it. And Rose. My father was a miner, one of the few men in this county who had the nerve to stand up to Blackwood. He organized a petition, got 30 signatures, took it to the county courthouse trying to get an audit of the bank's lending practices. Emmett's voice dropped. Rose disappeared 11 days later. Claire felt something cold move through her chest. Not fear, something deeper. Recognition. The recognition of a pattern that had repeated throughout human history. A powerful man who took what he wanted and destroyed anyone who stood in his way. You think Blackwood kidnapped her. I know he did. I've known it my whole life. My mother knew it. She died knowing it. She just couldn't prove it, and in 1933 in a coal town in West Virginia, a miner's daughter didn't disappear into headlines. She disappeared into silence.
Emmett opened the shoebox. Inside were 3 items: a creased black and white photograph of a teenage girl with dark hair and steady eyes, a folded newspaper clipping from 1934, yellowed and brittle, and a single pressed wildflower so old and flat it looked like a brown stain on tissue paper. Rose used to press flowers, Emmett said. Trillium. They grow wild in these mountains every spring. This was the last one she pressed before she vanished. My mother kept it in her Bible until the day she died. Then it passed to me. Claire looked at the photograph. Rose Marsh stared back at her across 92 years, her expression not afraid, not sad, but defiant. The face of a girl who knew the world was unfair and had decided to stare it down anyway. Pastor Marsh, Claire said, and her voice was steady even though her hands were not. I found something under your sister's captor's house, a hidden level below the basement, a stone corridor, and at the end of it, a steel door. Emmett Marsh closed his eyes. A single tear tracked down the deep furrows of his cheek. Then she's still down there, he whispered. I don't know what's behind that door yet, but I'm going to find out.
Why?
He opened his eyes.
Why would you do that? You don't know us. You don't owe this town anything. These people wouldn't lift a finger to help you.
Claire looked at the photograph of Rose Marsh one more time. 17 years old, dark hair, defiant eyes.
Because someone built a wall over your sister's prison and walked away. Because an entire town decided it was easier to forget than to look. And because I don't have the ability to stand in that house every day knowing there's a locked door beneath my feet and pretend it isn't there. She stood up. She placed her hand briefly on the old man's shoulder. I'll find her, Claire said. I promise you that. She walked out of the church into the pale West Virginia morning. The mountains rose around the valley like the walls of a bowl holding the town and its secrets in place, keeping everything contained.
The air smelled like pine and coal dust and something older than both. Claire got into the Honda Civic. Garrett looked at her.
"Well, drive home," she said. "We have a wall to finish breaking down."
The car pulled onto the road. In the rearview mirror, the church steeple tilted against the sky, and behind it, invisible from town, the roof line of 88 Briar Ridge Road rose above the trees like the back of a sleeping animal. Waiting. The steel door at the end of the stone corridor was not what Claire had expected. She had imagined something rusted and corroded, barely holding together after 9 decades underground. What she found instead was a monument to paranoia.
The door was massive. 6 feet tall, 4 feet wide, set into a steel frame that had been bolted directly into the stone walls with rivets as thick as a man's thumb. The surface was smooth cold to the touch and showed almost no corrosion. Whoever had built this had used high-grade steel, the kind used in bank vaults and military installations, and had sealed it into an environment so dry and airless that time had barely touched it. In the center of the door was a heavy rotary combination dial brass, with black numbering, the kind Claire had seen in photographs of old safes from the early 20th century. Below the dial was a thick steel handle, and below that a keyhole so small she almost missed it, partially concealed by a decorative steel plate.
Claire stood in front of the door for a long time. The flashlight beam played across its surface, catching the rivets, the dial, the faint scratches around the handle, where someone at some point had tried to force it open and failed. Garrett stood behind her. Neither of them spoke. The silence at this depth was absolute, the kind of silence that exists only underground, where there is no wind, no wildlife, no ambient sound of any kind. Just the faint rhythm of their own breathing and the distant, almost imaginary drip of water somewhere in the stone.
"We're not opening this today," Claire said. Garrett looked at her with visible relief. "Okay, good. That's the first rational thing either of us has said in 3 weeks." "I didn't say we're not opening it. I said not today. I need to understand what we're dealing with first." She turned away from the vault door and swept the flashlight back down the corridor. On their way in, they had passed the door so focused on reaching it that they hadn't fully examined the space. Now Claire moved slowly, methodically, the way she did when she was studying a design layout, looking for the elements that didn't fit the negative space that told its own story. 10 feet before the vault on the left side of the corridor was a doorway. No door in the frame, just an opening cut into the stone wall, perhaps 3 feet wide. Claire stepped through it. The room beyond was small, 8 feet by 10, roughly the size of a prison cell. The ceiling was low enough that Garrett had to duck. The walls were raw stone, and the floor was packed earth covered with what had once been straw, but had long since decomposed into a thin layer of brown dust. Against the far wall was an iron bed frame. No mattress, just a rusted metal skeleton with a flat surface of woven wire that had corroded and snapped in several places. Bolted to the wall above the bed at a height of about 4 feet was a heavy iron ring with a short length of chain still attached.
The chain ended in an open manacle. The hinge rusted but clearly functional, designed for a wrist, a small wrist.
Claire felt something shift inside her chest, a tightening, a heat, not fear, rage. The cold, quiet rage of a woman standing in a room where another woman had been kept like an animal. She forced herself to breathe. She swept the flashlight across the rest of the room. In the corner opposite the bed, partially hidden behind the iron frame, was a small wooden crate. Claire crouched down and opened it. Inside was a leather-bound journal roughly the size of a paperback book. The leather was cracked and dry but intact, and the pages inside, when Claire carefully opened the cover, were filled with small, cramped handwriting in pencil. The graphite had faded to a pale gray, but in the beam of the flashlight, it was still legible. The first page had a single line written at the top. My name is Rose Marsh. I am 17 years old. This is the 43rd day. Claire's hands began to shake. She closed the journal gently and held it against her chest, the way you hold something that is both precious and unbearable. Garrett, she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the dead silence of the underground, it carried perfectly. I need to read this before we do anything else. They went upstairs. Claire sat at the kitchen table with the journal, a glass of water, and a reading lamp they had rigged to a generator. Garrett sat across from her, silent, watching her face as she read. She read for 4 hours. Rose Marsh's journal was not a diary in the conventional sense. There were no entries about feelings, no reflections on her situation, no pleas for help. Rose had written it as a record, a document, evidence. Every entry was dated factual and precise, the work of a 17-year-old girl who understood that if she ever got out, her words would need to be believed. The entries began on day 1. Rose described being taken from her family's house at night. 2 men had come. She didn't know them by name, but she described them in detail, their heights, their builds, the way one of them smelled like chewing tobacco, and the other had a limp in his right leg. They had put a burlap sack over her head and driven her somewhere in a truck. When the sack came off, she was in the stone room. Silas Blackwood visited her on the 3rd day. Rose described him carefully. Tall, thin, gray hair combed back with oil. Hands that were unnervingly clean for a man who lived in coal country. He wore a 3-piece suit even in his own basement. He told Rose that her father had been warned, that the petition to audit the bank was an act of war against the town's economy, and that wars had casualties. He told her she would stay in the room until her father withdrew the petition and publicly apologized. If he refused, Rose would never leave. Her father withdrew the petition within a week. Rose did not leave. Claire read that passage twice. The second time, her vision blurred.
and she had to set the journal down and press her palms against her eyes. Garrett reached across the table and took her hand, but didn't speak. There was nothing to say.
Rose's captivity lasted from October of 1933 to October of 1934. 12 months. 365 days in an underground stone room, with a chain on her wrist and a bucket in the corner. Blackwood brought her food twice a day. He never touched her physically beyond the initial abduction. His cruelty was architectural. He had built a cage, and the cage itself was the punishment. But Rose Marsh was not the kind of girl who sat in a cage and waited. Starting around day 60, the journal entries changed. They became more detailed, more technical. Rose had begun to study her captor. She noted the times he visited, the sounds she heard through the walls, the direction of his footsteps, whether they went toward the vault or away from it. She counted the clicks of the combination dial when he opened it, estimating the numbers by the duration and direction of each rotation. By day 100, she had the combination. By day 140, she had figured out the key. Blackwood kept it on a chain around his neck, but he removed the chain when he ate, setting it on the small table he used when he sat in the corridor reviewing his ledgers. Rose had watched him through the gap between the doorframe and the wall, memorizing the shape of the key, the position of the keyhole, the sequence of his ritual. And then she discovered the trap. On day 173, Rose wrote an entry that made Claire's blood go cold. He showed me today. He wanted me to know. He stood at the vault door and pointed to the mechanism beneath the dial. He said if anyone ever tries to turn the handle without first inserting the key and rotating it counterclockwise, the phosphorus charges in the floor will ignite. He said the entire corridor will burn at temperatures that melt steel. He said this is his insurance. He said the money, the ledgers, and I will all burn together before he lets anyone take what is his. He smiled when he said it. He wanted me to understand that even if someone found this place, even if they broke through the wall and reached the door, they would die trying to open it. He designed it that way. He is proud of it. Rose was quiet for several entries after that. Short lines, weather observations she could only guess at from the temperature of the stone, the number of drips she counted from the ceiling, the shape of a crack in the wall that she said looked like a bird. Then on day 212, this. I have been studying the mechanism from inside the room when he opens the door. The trigger is mechanical, not electrical. A wire runs from the keyhole assembly through the wall to a sealed canister beneath the floor. The wire is under tension. Turning the handle without the key releases the tension and strikes a flint against the canister's ignition point. But if the key is inserted first, it physically blocks the striker arm. The key is the safety. Without it, the door is a bomb. Last night while he was upstairs, I used the wire from my bed frame to reach through the gap beneath the vault door. I bent the striker arm, not enough to break it, enough to misalign it. If someone turns the handle now without the key, the striker will swing, but miss the ignition point by approximately 1/4 inch. I cannot guarantee this will work. I cannot test it, but I have done what I can. I do not know who will find this room after I am gone, but I know someone will eventually. And when they stand in front of that door, they will not know about the phosphorus. They will not know about the striker. They will simply turn the handle, because that is what people do when they find a locked door. I have given them a chance. That is all I can do from inside this chain. Claire set the journal down. She was crying. Not sobbing, not making sound, just tears running down her face in 2 steady streams while her jaw remained set and her breathing stayed even. The kind of crying that comes not from sadness, but from the overwhelming collision of grief and admiration. This girl, this 17-year-old girl chained to a wall in the dark, had thought about the future, had thought about the stranger who would one day stand where Claire was standing. And instead of writing a plea for help, instead of scratching prayers into the stone she had reached through the gap beneath a steel door with a piece of wire from her own bed and sabotaged a dead man's killing machine. Rose Marsh had saved Claire's life 91 years before Claire was born. What does it say? Garrett asked quietly. Claire wiped her face with the back of her hand. She told him everything. The next morning, Claire went back down, alone. She brought the journal, a notebook, a pencil, and the flashlight. She told Garrett to wait upstairs. If she wasn't back in 2 hours, he was to call the state police, not the Ashford Hollow Sheriff's Department. She descended the staircase and walked the stone corridor to the vault door. She did not touch it. Instead, she sat on the floor in front of it and opened Rose's journal to the entry about the mechanism. She read it 3 times. Then she examined the door with the flashlight inch by inch, starting at the top and working her way down. The keyhole was where Rose described it, concealed beneath a decorative plate below the main dial. Claire used a flathead screwdriver to pry the plate aside, revealing a small brass keyhole aligned with a vertical slot in the door frame. She traced the edges of the door with her fingertips. At the base where the door met the stone floor, there was a gap of perhaps 1/2 inch. Just wide enough, Claire thought, for a girl with thin wrists and nothing but time to slide a piece of wire through. Claire had not opened the vault yet because Claire was not impulsive. She was not Garrett, who would have grabbed the sledgehammer and started swinging. She was a woman who measured walls 3 times before she made a mark, who read contracts before she signed them, who planned exits before she entered rooms. She needed to find the key, and she needed to understand the secondary trap. Rose's journal mentioned the phosphorus trigger on the door, but Rose also wrote on day 230 a line that Claire had circled in her notebook. There is something else. He spends time at the desk inside the vault. I can hear the drawers opening and closing. He is more careful with the desk
than with anything else, even the door. He handles those drawers the way a man handles a loaded weapon. The desk. Whatever else Blackwood had rigged it wasn't just the door. The desk was the second trap. The fail-safe within the fail-safe. Claire needed the key. She searched the stone room where Rose had been held, running her hands over every surface, checking every crack and crevice. Nothing. She searched the corridor floor, the walls, the base of the vault door. Then she found the tin box. It was small, maybe 5 inches by 3, made of rusted tin, with a hinged lid. It was wedged beneath the bottom hinge of the vault door, pushed so far back that it was invisible unless you lay flat on the floor and shined a light directly into the gap. Claire pulled it out. The latch was broken. She opened it. Inside were 4 items: a heavy brass key tarnished black with age, a single unspent .45 caliber bullet, a folded piece of yellowed parchment, and a smaller piece of paper, different texture, different handwriting, folded separately. Claire unfolded the parchment first. The handwriting was elegant, precise, written in faded black ink. To whoever breaks the seal. The combination is 42187. Use the key to disarm the tumbler lock first. Do not turn the handle without turning the key, or the phosphorus trigger will ignite the contents. I have taken what I am owed. Let the town of Ashford Hollow burn for their sins. Silas Blackwood, the 14th of October, 1934. The second note was written in pencil on a torn piece of notebook paper. The handwriting was small and cramped. Rose's handwriting. I bent the striker, but I could not reach the second mechanism. It is inside the room. The desk. Do not open the desk drawers. He rigged them the same way. There is no key for the desk. There is no safety. If you open those drawers, everything inside this room will burn. Take the ledgers from the top of the desk. Leave the drawers closed. Get out. My name is Rose Marsh. I was here. Claire read both notes sitting on the cold stone floor, the flashlight balanced on her knee. When she finished, she sat still for a long time. The silence pressed in around her. The air smelled of mineral and age, and the faintest trace of something chemical. Something that had been sleeping in the walls for almost a century, waiting to be woken. Then she stood up. She inserted the brass key into the hidden keyhole. It slid in with a resistance that told her the mechanism was still sound, still functional, still ready to do what it had been designed to do. She turned the key counterclockwise. A deep mechanical clack echoed through the steel door, a sound of heavy internal components shifting, disengaging, standing down. The safety was active. The striker arm, whether bent by Rose or not, was now physically blocked. Claire gripped the combination dial. Her fingers were steady. Her pulse was not. 42. She turned it right. 18. She turned it left. 7. She turned it right. She gripped the heavy steel handle. She pulled it down. The vault door resisted for a moment, the hinges frozen with 9 decades of stillness. Then, with a groaning protest of metal against metal, it swung open. The air that rushed out was cold and stale, and carried with it the concentrated essence of the room's contents. Old paper, dry wood, metal, and beneath it all, something sweet and wrong. Something organic. Something that had once been alive. Claire stepped inside. The vault was larger than she had expected. Not a closet or a safe, but a full room roughly 12 feet square with a ceiling just high enough to stand in. The walls were reinforced steel matching the door. The floor was concrete poured smooth. In the center of the room stood an oak desk. Heavy, old-fashioned, with brass drawer pulls and a leather writing surface that had cracked and curled with age. On top of the desk, arranged in neat stacks, were leather-bound ledgers. 6 of them, each one as thick as a Bible, their spines labeled with years. 1920 through 1934. Along the back wall, stacked from floor to ceiling, were wooden crates. 12 of them, identical, each one about the size of a footlocker. The wood was dry and pale, the nails rusted but holding. Claire went to the nearest crate. She used the claw of a hammer to pry up the lid. The nails squealed as they released. The crate was filled with money. Not modern currency. Large format bills wider and longer than anything printed today, with elaborate engravings and golden yellow backgrounds. They were bundled in neat stacks, each stack secured with a paper band. Claire picked up a stack and held it under the flashlight. $1,000 gold certificates. Series of 1928. Each bill featuring the portrait of a man she didn't recognize printed on paper that felt more like cloth than currency. The bills were in remarkable condition, preserved by the airtight seal of the vault. Claire set the stack down. She looked at the 12 crates. If each one contained a similar quantity, if each stack was $1,000, if each crate held hundreds of stacks, then she was standing in front of an amount of money so large that her brain refused to calculate it. She did not touch the other crates. She did not open the desk drawers. She remembered Rose's warning written in pencil on a torn piece of paper by a girl in chains. Do not open the desk drawers. Instead, Claire turned to the desk and began examining the ledgers. She opened the first one, the one labeled 1920, and began to read. Silas Blackwood had been meticulous. The ledgers were not simple financial records. They were a comprehensive catalog of human weakness. Each page was organized by family name written in Blackwood's elegant hand, with columns detailing the nature of each family's debt, the collateral they had provided, and in a separate column on the far right, the leverage Blackwood held over them. The leverage column was devastating. Detailed notes about affairs, illegitimate children, criminal acts, addiction, financial fraud. Every prominent family in Ashford Hollow was represented. The Caldwells, the Suttons, the Pierces, the Burkes, and the Cranes. Judith Crane's family. Multiple entries spanning years, detailing loans that were never meant to be repaid, collateral that was never meant to be returned. But one name appeared differently from all the others. Not as a debtor, not as a victim, as a partner. Throughout the ledgers referenced in dozens of entries was a figure identified only as the overseer. This person received 40% of every extortion payment Blackwood collected, 40% of every foreclosed property, 40% of every bribe. The overseer was not a victim of Blackwood's system. The overseer was its co-architect. Claire spent an hour cross-referencing the entries. The overseer's payments were routed through a shell account at the county courthouse disguised as municipal tax receipts. The account was registered to a name that appeared only once in a footnote on the final page of the 1931 ledger. Wilton Thorne.
Claire sat back. She knew that name. Not Wilton, but Thorne. The Thornes were the most prominent family in Ashford Hollow. Their name was on the town hall, the county courthouse, the elementary school. And the current patriarch of the Thorne family, the man whose name was on every campaign sign she had seen driving into town, was Mayor Colton Thorne. Silas Blackwood had not acted alone. He had a partner. And that partner's great-grandson was currently the most powerful man in Ashford Hollow.
Claire closed the ledger. Her mind was moving fast now, assembling the pieces. The house listed at an impossible price. The cash-only terms. The prohibition on inspections. Judith Crane's nervous hands and evasive answers. The town's coordinated silence. The warning at the diner. This wasn't a ghost story. This wasn't superstition. The town of Ashford Hollow wasn't afraid of the Blackwood house because of what might be inside it. They were afraid because they knew exactly what was inside it, and the people in power needed it to stay buried. But then she looked at the back corner of the vault. She had been so focused on the desk and the crates that she hadn't examined the entire room. Now, as her flashlight swept the far corner, the beam caught something that did not belong among the currency and the ledgers. A shape on the floor, partially concealed by the last stack of crates pressed into the corner where the steel walls met the concrete floor.
Claire walked toward it. Each step felt like a descent of its own, as though the floor were tilting downward, pulling her towards something she already knew she would wish she hadn't seen. It was a skeleton, small, positioned in a seated posture, the back resting against the wall, the legs extended, the arms folded across the lap. The bones were intact, undisturbed, arranged with the natural settling of a body that had simply stopped and remained. Scraps of fabric clung to the bones, remnants of clothing that had once been a dress. Dark fabric, formal. And around the neck bones, resting against the clavicle, was a necklace. A thin gold chain with a pendant that caught the flashlight beam and threw it back in a sharp point of light. Claire crouched down. She did not touch the remains. She studied the pendant. It was an oval locket, and it had fallen open at some point
during the decades, revealing a tiny photograph inside. A man and a woman standing side by side in formal pose. A wedding photograph. The man in the photograph was tall, thin, gray-haired. Even in the tiny image, Claire recognized the face from the historical photographs she had seen in Garrett's research on the house. Silas Blackwood. The woman in the photograph was wearing the same dress that now clung in fragments to the skeleton on the floor. This was Margaret Blackwood, Silas Blackwood's wife. The woman who, according to every public record in the county, had left Ashford Hollow in 1932 to live with relatives in New York. The woman who had simply vanished from the town's records as though she had never existed. She hadn't gone to New York. She had never left this room. Claire stood up slowly. Her legs were unsteady. The vault suddenly felt smaller than it had a minute ago. The walls pressing inward, the ceiling lowering the weight of the house, and the earth above it bearing down on this steel box, and the dead woman in the corner, and the living woman standing over her. This was not Rose. Rose had been kept in the room outside the vault, chained to the wall, alive. This was someone else. This was a murder that had been hidden inside a locked room, inside a sealed corridor, inside a walled-off basement for 91 years. And the town had known. They had to have known. Margaret Blackwood doesn't just disappear from a town of 300 people without questions. But the questions had been silenced the same way everything in Ashford Hollow had been silenced by Blackwood's money and Blackwood's ledgers and the heavy suffocating weight of collective complicity. Claire left the vault. She sealed the door behind her, but did not reset the combination. She climbed the stone staircase, walked through the basement, and emerged into the kitchen where Garrett was sitting at the table grading papers, trying to maintain some fragment of normal life in a house that was revealing itself to be anything but normal. She told him everything. The gold certificates, the ledgers, the overseer, Margaret Blackwood's skeleton in the corner of the vault. Garrett listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time.
"We need to call the police," he said. "Which police?" "The Ashford Hollow Sheriff's Department. The department that reports to a mayor whose great-grandfather was Blackwood's business partner. Then the state police, the FBI. And tell them what? That we found a skeleton and some old money in a house we bought for $12,000. They'll send someone in 6 months. By then, every piece of evidence in that vault will have disappeared, and we'll be the ones who look crazy." Claire sat down across from him. She pulled her laptop toward her.
"I need to document everything first. Photograph every page of every ledger. Photograph the skeleton, the vault, the room where Rose was kept. Upload everything to cloud storage with a time-stamped backup. And I need to do it before anyone in this town finds out we opened that door. Claire, this is dangerous. These people killed Blackwood. They've been covering up his crimes for 90 years. If the mayor finds out what we have down there, what do you think he's going to do?"
Claire looked at him. Her expression was calm. Her eyes were not.
"That's exactly why I'm not giving him the chance to do anything."
She worked through the night. She descended into the vault 3 times, each time carrying her phone and a portable battery pack, photographing every page of every ledger with methodical precision. She photographed the crates, the currency, the desk. She photographed Margaret Blackwood's remains from multiple angles, including close-ups of the locket and the wedding photograph inside it. She photographed Rose's journal, every page, front and back, including the torn note about the desk trap. Then she uploaded everything. Cloud storage, 3 separate services, different passwords, different email addresses. She set up a scheduled email, a dead man's switch. If she didn't log in and cancel the send within 48 hours, the entire archive would be automatically delivered to the FBI field office in Charleston, the West Virginia State Police, and the investigative desks of 3 major newspapers. It was 4 a.m. when she finished. She sat at the kitchen table, eyes burning, hands aching, and felt for the first time since they had arrived in Ashford Hollow something that resembled control. Then she slept for 2 hours and drove into town. She didn't go to the diner. She didn't go to the hardware store. She drove to Crane County Realty and walked in without knocking. Judith Crane was sitting behind her metal desk with a cup of coffee and a stack of papers. She looked up when Claire entered, and in the half-second before she arranged her face into a professional mask, Claire saw something raw in the woman's expression. Not guilt exactly. Exhaustion. The bone-deep weariness of someone who had been carrying a weight for a very long time. "Mrs. Whitfield, what can I do for you?" Claire sat down in the folding chair across the desk. She didn't waste time. "I opened the vault." Judith Crane's coffee cup stopped halfway to her mouth. She set it down very slowly, as though it had become suddenly fragile. "I found the gold certificates. I found the ledgers. All 6 of them. I found the skeleton of Margaret Blackwood in the corner of the room. And I found the name Wilton Thorne on page 412 of the 1931 ledger, listed as the co-beneficiary of every extortion scheme Silas Blackwood ran for 14 years. The color drained from Judith's face in stages like water receding from a shore. "You need to listen to me," Claire continued. "I know you didn't sell us that house because you wanted to. I've read enough of those ledgers to know that the Crane family was in Blackwood's book too. And I suspect Mayor Thorne has been using whatever his great-grandfather left him to keep your family in line the same way Blackwood did." Judith's hands were flat on the desk. Her knuckles were white. "You don't understand what you've done," she said. Her voice was barely audible. "You don't understand how this town works." "Then tell me." Judith closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were wet. "Colton Thorne has run this county since he was 30 years old. His father ran it before him. His grandfather before that. The Thornes have always known about the vault. They've always known what was inside it. But they couldn't get to it because Blackwood rigged the door, and everyone who was alive in 34 saw what happened when the men who killed Blackwood tried to force it open. 2 of them burned. Their screams were heard all the way in town.
So they sealed it. They walled it up, and they sold a story. Haunted house. Cursed property. Blackwood's ghost. The young people believed it. The old people knew better, but kept their mouths shut because the Thorns owned the mortgage on every house on Main Street. Same game, different generation. And you? Claire asked. Where do you fit? Judith's jaw tightened. Colton came to me 3 years ago. He said it was time to try again. Get someone from outside to buy the place. Price it so low that only someone desperate would take it. Someone with nothing to lose. Someone who might be dumb enough or brave enough to find the vault and open it. And if they triggered the trap,
Then the house burns, the vault melts, and the ledgers are destroyed, which is what Colton wants more than the money. Those ledgers are the only proof that his family was part of it. Without them, the Thorns are just another founding family. With them, they're accomplices to kidnapping, extortion, and murder. So you sold us a death trap. Judith flinched. She looked at Claire, and for the first time, the mask was gone entirely. I tried to choose carefully. I screened every caller. Most of them were flippers, investors, people who would have torn the house down without ever going into the basement. I needed someone who would actually look. Someone who might figure it out before the trap got them. She paused. When you told me your husband was a history teacher and you were a designer, I thought maybe these two will pay attention. Maybe they'll measure the walls. I did measure the walls, Claire said. I know, and I'm glad. But you need to understand my brother Earl is Colton's man. Deputy sheriff appointed by Thorn, loyal to Thorn. Earl doesn't care about justice or history or the Marsh Girl's diary. Earl cares about the promotion Colton promised him and the money in those crates. If Colton finds out you've been inside that vault, Earl will come for you, and he won't come to talk. Claire stood up. She placed both hands on the desk and leaned forward. Judith, I have photographed every page of every ledger, every entry, every name, every transaction, including the ones that mention your family. Right now, those photographs are sitting in 3 separate cloud accounts with a dead man's switch set to deliver them to the FBI, the state police, and the Washington Post in 46 hours unless I personally cancel the send. Judith stared at her. If anything happens to me or my husband, those files go out automatically. If we disappear, they go out. If we have an accident on a dark mountain road, they go out. The only way those files stay private is if Garrett and I remain alive and free to cancel the timer every 48 hours for as long as we choose. The room was very quiet. Outside, a truck rumbled past on Main Street. A dog barked somewhere down the block. You're not what I expected, Judith said softly. I never am. Claire drove to First Methodist Church. It was Wednesday. She hadn't spoken to Emmett Marsh since Sunday morning, but she had promised him answers, and now she had them. She had Rose's journal. She knew Rose had been held in the room beneath the house. She knew Rose had survived long enough to write 300 pages and sabotage a killing mechanism.
But she didn't yet know what had happened to Rose after October of 1934, when the townsmen came for Blackwood. The church parking lot was empty. This was unusual. Emmett's old Buick sedan, a car so ancient it might have qualified for historical preservation, was always parked in the same spot by the side door. He lived in a small cottage behind the church, had lived there for decades, and was known in town as a man of absolute routine. Morning prayers at 6, coffee on the porch at 7, a walk to the post office at 9. The Buick never moved except on Sundays. The Buick was not there. Claire walked to the church door. Locked. She went around to the cottage. The front door was closed. She knocked. No answer. She peered through the window. The kitchen was tidy, a coffee cup washed and placed upside down on the drying rack. The living room was undisturbed. But on the small table by the front door, where Emmett kept his wallet and his car keys, there was nothing. She walked back to the church. On the front steps, catching the light, was a pair of glasses. Wire-rimmed, round-lensed, with a crack in the left temple arm that had been repaired with a small piece of medical tape. Emmett Marsh's glasses. Claire had seen them on his face every time they had spoken. He had adjusted them constantly, a nervous habit, pushing them up the bridge of his nose with his index finger. A 95-year-old man with failing eyesight does not leave his glasses on the church steps and drive away. He does not leave voluntarily at all without the glasses that allow him to see the road. Claire picked them up. The lenses were smudged but unbroken. She held them in her palm and felt the weight of them, the intimate smallness of an old man's spectacles. And she understood with absolute clarity what had happened. They had taken him. Thorne's people, Earl Crane. They had taken the one person in Ashford Hollow who had a personal stake in the truth, the one person who might have gone to outside authorities on his own, and they had removed him from the equation. Claire stood on the church steps for a long time. The mountains rose around the valley, ancient and indifferent, their ridgelines sharp against the pale sky. The town below was quiet. Smoke rose from a few chimneys. A flag hung limp on the post office pole. Everything looked peaceful. Everything looked normal. But beneath the surface, beneath the quiet streets and the polite nods and the hand-painted diner signs, Ashford Hollow was a machine. It had always been a machine. Built by Blackwood, maintained by the Thornes, powered by silence and fear, and the collective agreement of decent people to look the other way. Claire put Emmett's glasses in her jacket pocket. She got in the Honda Civic and drove back to Briar Ridge Road. Garrett was on the porch when she pulled in. He stood up when he saw her face. What happened? Emmett is gone. They took him. Who took him? Thorne, Earl. Does it matter which one held the steering wheel? They took a 95-year-old man because he talked to us, because he was the only person in this town who wanted the truth more than he wanted safety. Claire walked past him into the house. She went to the kitchen table, opened her laptop, and logged into her cloud accounts. She checked the dead man's switch. 44 hours remaining. The files were intact. The timer was running. She closed the laptop and looked at her husband. "We're not running," she said. "I know that's what a smart person would do. Get in the car, drive to Charleston, hand everything to the FBI, and let the system work." But the system has had 91 years to work, and it hasn't, because the system in this county is Colton Thorne. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to make him come to me, on my terms, in my house." "Claire, he has a deputy with a badge and a gun.
And I have 6 ledgers full of evidence that his family helped a murderer run this town for 14 years. Evidence that's sitting in the cloud right now, pointed at every institution that could destroy him. He doesn't know that yet. When he finds out, he's going to have a choice. And I'm going to make sure he makes it in front of witnesses."
Garrett was quiet. He looked at her the way he sometimes did, the way he had looked at her the night she found the listing, the morning she called Judith Crane, the moment she picked up the sledgehammer. With something that went beyond love. With the recognition that the woman he had married was capable of things he would never fully understand, and that the best thing he could do was stand beside her and make sure she wasn't standing alone. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "I need you to trust me, and I need you to be here when they come. Because they're coming, Garrett, probably tonight. And when they walk through that door, they need to see 2 people who aren't afraid." "I am afraid," he said. "I know. So am I." But Rose Marsh was afraid for 365 days in a room with no light and no hope. And she still reached through a gap in a steel door with a piece of wire and saved the life of a woman she would never meet. If she could do that, I can do this. The sun went down behind the mountains at 7:18. The house on Briar Ridge Road settled into its nightly silence. The weeping willows swayed in a breeze that carried the scent of pine and distant rain. Somewhere in the woods, an owl called once and was answered by nothing. Claire sat in the parlor with the lights off. Garrett sat beside her. They didn't speak. They listened to the house, to the old wood settling, to the faint creak of the porch in the wind, to the silence beneath the silence, the sound of a place holding its breath. At 9:47, headlights appeared at the end of the driveway. 2 vehicles, moving slowly, the gravel crunching beneath their tires like teeth grinding. Claire stood up. "They're here," she said. The first vehicle was a black Chevrolet Tahoe, the kind used by county law enforcement across rural America. Its light bar was dark. No sirens. No announcement. It pulled to a stop 30 feet from the front porch, its engine idling, its headlights pinning the house in 2 columns of harsh white light. The second vehicle was a silver Lincoln Town Car, polished to a mirror finish absurdly out of place on the dirt driveway of a decaying craftsman house in the West Virginia hills. It parked beside the Tahoe, and its engine cut immediately.
The headlights died. The silence that followed was enormous. Claire stood at the front window of the parlor, watching through the gap in the curtains she had hung 3 days ago. Garrett was beside her, his hand resting on the handle of the sledgehammer, leaning against the wall. Not as a weapon, as a comfort. The familiar weight of a tool in a situation where tools were useless. 4 doors opened, 2 on each vehicle. 4 figures emerged into the night. From the Tahoe, the driver's side stepped a man in a tan deputy's uniform. Claire recognized the silhouette before the porch light caught his face. Earl Crane, Judith's brother. He was broad-shouldered and thick-necked, built like a man who had played football in high school and never entirely stopped expecting the world to move out of his way. His hand rested on his holstered sidearm with the casual familiarity of someone who touched it the way other men touched their wallets out of habit, out of reassurance that it was still there. From the passenger side of the Tahoe came a second man, shorter, older, wearing a canvas work jacket and a trucker cap. Claire didn't recognize him, but she noted the way he deferred to Earl, staying a half step behind his hands stuffed in his pockets. A follower. Muscle. Nothing more. From the town car's driver's seat stepped a third man, also in a work jacket, also unfamiliar, also staying close to the vehicle with the nervous energy of someone who wasn't sure he wanted to be here. And from the passenger side of the Lincoln, moving with the unhurried grace of a man who had never been rushed in his life, stepped Colton Thorne. Claire had seen him on campaign signs. She had seen his photograph in the glass case at the post office, a formal portrait of the mayor above a plaque that read, "Serving Ashford Hollow since 1998. In those images, he looked like what he presented himself to be, a small-town politician, a Rotary Club handshaker, a man who cut ribbons at the county fair and gave speeches about community values at the Veterans Day parade. In person, in the dark, walking toward her house with a deputy and 2 men who clearly weren't here for conversation. Colton Thorne looked like something else entirely. He was 63 years old, tall and lean, with silver hair swept back from a high forehead, and the kind of face that had been handsome once and had hardened into something more useful than handsome. Authority. The face of a man who had spent 3 decades being the most important person in every room he entered, and had long since stopped questioning whether he deserved it. He walked up the porch steps. He didn't knock. He stood at the front door and waited, his hands clasped in front of him, his posture that of a man arriving at a meeting he had called. Claire opened the door. They stood facing each other across the threshold. The porch light cast deep shadows under Thorne's brow, turning his eyes into dark hollows. Behind him, Earl Crane's hand tightened on his holster. The 2 other men hung back near the vehicles, shifting their weight. "Mrs. Whitfield," Thorne said. His voice was measured, warm even, the voice of a man who had learned that courtesy was more effective than force, at least as an opening move. "I apologize for the hour. I understand you and your husband have been doing remarkable work on the old place.
The whole town's been talking about it.
The whole town's been avoiding us, Claire said.
There's a difference.
Thorne smiled. It was a patient smile, practiced the kind he probably used when a constituent brought a complaint to his office that he had no intention of addressing. Small towns can be slow to warm up to newcomers. It's not personal. Folks here have long memories and old habits.
I'm aware of the long memories, Claire said. I've been reading about them. The smile remained, but something shifted behind it, a tightening around the eyes, a calculation. May we come in?
That depends on why you're here. Thorne tilted his head slightly, as though considering the question for the first time. Neighborly concern, mostly. Brianna, my secretary, mentioned that your husband was asking about the history of this property at the county records office, and my understanding is that you've been doing some digging, literally and figuratively.
He glanced past her into the darkened parlor.
I thought it might be wise to have a conversation before misunderstandings develop. There's no misunderstanding, Claire said.
She stepped back from the door, not as an invitation, but as a repositioning. She wanted space. She wanted to see all four of them at once.
Come in.
Thorne entered first. Earl followed, his boots heavy on the hardwood floor, his eyes scanning the room the way a man scans a room when he's looking for exits and threats. The two men from the vehicles came in last, standing near the door like sentries. Garrett was standing by the fireplace, arms crossed. He didn't speak. Claire had asked him to let her lead, and he was honoring that, though she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw was set. Thorne surveyed the parlor. He took in the cleaned walls, the restored woodwork, the generator-powered lamps casting warm light across the room. His gaze lingered on the staircase, then moved to the hallway that led to the basement door. You've done beautiful work, he said. This house hasn't looked this good since before I was born. My grandfather used to tell me about what it looked like in its prime. Silas Blackwood had taste, whatever else you might say about the man. Whatever else I might say, Claire repeated. That's a diplomatic way to describe a man who ran a blackmail operation, murdered his wife, and kidnapped a 17-year-old girl. The room went very still. Earl's hand moved from resting on his holster to gripping it. The two men by the door exchanged a glance. Thorne's expression didn't change, but the temperature of his courtesy dropped several degrees. You've been busy, he said quietly. I've been thorough. There's a difference. Thorne was silent for a moment. He walked slowly across the parlor, his shoes clicking on the hardwood, and stopped in front of the fireplace mantel. He ran one finger along the carved stone, collecting a thin line of dust. Mrs. Whitfield. Claire. May I call you Claire? You may not. He withdrew his hand from the mantel and turned to face her. The mask of geniality was thinning. Beneath it, she could see the architecture of the man, the framework that held him together. Control, certainty, the absolute conviction that he was the most important person in this room, in this town, in this county, and that reality would eventually bend to accommodate that fact.
Let me be direct then, he said. This house has a history that is painful for this community. Silas Blackwood was a predator. Everyone agrees on that. What happened in 1934, when certain men in this town took matters into their own hands, was not legal, but it was necessary. Blackwood had a stranglehold on every family in Ashford Hollow. He had to be stopped.
And your great-grandfather helped him hold that stranglehold, Claire said. Wilton Thorne, the overseer, 40% of every dollar Blackwood squeezed out of this town went into your family's pocket. Earl Crane took a step forward. Thorne held up one hand without looking at him, and Earl stopped. The gesture was almost imperceptible, the casual authority of a man who controlled people the way other men controlled dogs, with small gestures and the implicit threat of consequences.
My great-grandfather made choices I can't defend, Thorne said. Every family in this town has ancestors who made choices they can't defend. That's what happens when one man has the power Blackwood had. People survive however they can. The Thornes survived. The Cranes survived. The Suttons, the Pierces, the Burkes. We all survived, and we built something afterward. A community. Imperfect, yes, but ours.
And the price of that community was silence, Claire said. About Margaret Blackwood's murder. About Rose Marsh's kidnapping. About the fact that there is a dead woman's skeleton in a steel vault under this house right now, and every person in power in this town knew it was there and chose to leave it.
Sometimes, Thorne said, and his voice had lost its warmth entirely. A town needs to forget its past in order to have a future. I'm not proud of what happened here, but I am proud of what we've built since, and I will not let one outsider with a sledgehammer and a sense of righteous indignation tear it apart. He took a step toward her. Earl unclipped his holster. I need the ledgers, Mrs. Whitfield, and I need whatever remains are in that vault to be sealed and forgotten the way they should have been forgotten 90 years ago. This is not a negotiation. This is a courtesy. I am giving you the chance to walk away from this house with your lives and your freedom, which is more courtesy than most people in my position would extend. And if I refuse,
then Deputy Crane will arrest you and your husband for trespassing on county property destruction of a historically protected structure and disturbing human remains without a coroner's authorization. You'll spend the weekend in county lockup, and by Monday morning, this house will be condemned. The basement will be filled with concrete, and every record of your purchase will be lost in a filing error that nobody will ever investigate. Claire looked at Earl Crane. His gun was still holstered, but his hand was wrapped around the grip, his thumb resting on the snap. His face was flushed. He was enjoying this. He was a man who had spent his career as a small-town deputy pulling over teenagers and writing parking tickets, and tonight he had been given permission to be something larger, something dangerous. The eagerness in his eyes made Claire's stomach turn. She looked at the two men by the door. They were nervous. Their eyes darted between Thorne and the exit. They were here because they had been told to be here, not because they wanted to be. Council members, probably. Men who owed Thorne favors they couldn't repay. She looked at Garrett. He was looking at her, waiting, trusting. Then headlights swept across the front windows. A fifth vehicle was pulling into the driveway. Everyone turned. The door opened and Judith Crane walked in. She was not the Judith Crane that Claire had met 3 weeks ago. That woman had been controlled, buttoned up, a professional surface stretched tight over a lifetime of accommodation. The woman who walked through the front door of 88 Briar Ridge Road was shaking. Her mascara was smeared. Her blazer was wrinkled. She was carrying a manila folder in her left hand, and she was looking directly at her brother. "Judith," Earl said, his voice sharp with warning. "What are you doing here?"
Something I should have done 20 years ago. She turned to Thorne. "It's over, Colton." Thorne's composure flickered. Just barely. Just enough for Claire to see the first crack in the foundation.
"Judith, this isn't the time." "This is exactly the time." She held up the manila folder. "I drove to the Millhaven property on Route 9 tonight, the old Sutton lumber warehouse, the one you told Earl to use for storage." She opened the folder and held up a photograph. It was taken with the phone in low light, but the image was clear enough. A small cot in a concrete room. A folding table with a plate of food and a glass of water. And sitting on the cot, looking frail and confused, but very much alive, was Emmett Marsh.
"You kidnapped a 95-year-old minister,"
Judith said, her voice breaking. "You dragged him out of his home in the middle of the night and locked him in a warehouse because he talked to a woman who bought a house. Because he told her about his sister Colton, a girl who was taken from her family by the man your great-grandfather helped. And your response was to do the exact same thing. 91 years later, and the Thornes are still locking people up to protect their secrets." Earl took a step toward his sister. His hand was on his gun. "Judith, shut your mouth. You don't know what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about. I've been selling Colton's lies for 20 years. I've been steering buyers away from this property or toward it, depending on what he needed. I've been managing his real estate portfolio, laundering foreclosure records, making sure the county assessor's numbers always came out in his favor. And I'm done." She looked at Claire. In her eyes was something that had not been there before. Not fear, not exhaustion, resolve. "I'm standing with her." Thorne's face hardened. The last trace of courtesy evaporated. What remained was the face of a man whose great-grandfather had partnered with a monster, whose grandfather had sealed the evidence, whose father had maintained the silence, and who had inherited all of it, the money, the power, the complicity, and the absolute conviction that it belonged to him. "You're making a mistake, Judith. Both of you." "No," Claire said. "You're making a mistake, and you've been making it your whole life. You just never had anyone tell you." She reached into her back pocket and pulled out her phone. She held it up so Thorne could see the screen. Every page of every ledger in that vault has been photographed. High resolution, time-stamped. Every entry about the Thorne family, every payment to the overseer, every record of Wilton Thorne's involvement in Blackwood's operation.
I've also photographed the skeleton of Margaret Blackwood Rose Marsh's journal and the booby trap schematics that prove Silas Blackwood intended to destroy the evidence if anyone ever tried to take it. Thorne stared at the phone. All of it is sitting in 3 separate cloud storage accounts right now. Encrypted, backed up. I set this up before I ever opened the vault, because I grew up in places where people with power take things from people without power, and the only defense is to make sure the evidence exists somewhere they can't reach. She lowered the phone. There's a timer, a dead man's switch. If I don't personally log in and reset it within the next 36 hours, every file, every photograph, every page of every ledger gets automatically delivered to the FBI field office in Charleston, the West Virginia State Police, and the investigative desks of the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Charleston Gazette-Mail. I set it up the night I found the ledgers, because I knew this moment was coming. I knew you'd show up at my door with a deputy and a threat and expect me to fold. The parlor was silent. The 2 council members by the door had gone pale. One of them was staring at the floor. The other was edging toward the exit. So here's what's going to happen, Mayor Thorne, Claire said. You are going to release Emmett Marsh tonight. You are going to drive to that warehouse, unlock the door, and bring him home. Then you are going to go back to your office and wait. Because tomorrow morning I am calling the state police and the FBI myself. Not because the timer forced me to. Because it's the right thing to do. Because Margaret Blackwood deserves to be buried with her name. Because Rose Marsh deserves to have her story told. And because this town deserves to stop carrying a dead man's secrets. Thorne's jaw was working. The muscles in his face were tight, his eyes narrow, calculating. Claire could see him running the odds, measuring the threats, looking for the angle that would let him regain control. He didn't find one. This will destroy the town, he said. His voice was low, almost a whisper. Every family, every name in those ledgers. Do you understand that the Cranes, the Suttons, the Pierces, they're not the Thornes? They're not villains. They're people whose great-grandparents were victims of a monster, and now you want to drag their names through the national press. Their great-grandparents were victims, Claire said. But you're not. You had a choice. Every year for the last 25 years, you had a choice. You could have opened that vault yourself. You could have called the FBI yourself. You could have told the truth and let this town heal. Instead, you kidnapped an old man and sent a deputy with a gun to intimidate a woman in her own home. You don't get to claim victimhood. Not tonight. Thorne stood motionless for a long moment. His silver hair caught the lamplight. His face was a mask of furious calculation. Then he turned to Earl and said very quietly, "Get the ledgers." "Don't," Claire said. But Earl Crane was not a man who listened to women. He was not a man who calculated risks or weighed consequences. He was a man who had been promised a promotion and a share of a fortune, and he had been waiting for this moment with the tunnel vision hunger of a dog watching a steak. He pushed past Claire. He pushed past Garrett, who stepped forward to block him and was shoved aside by 220 pounds of deputy moving. with the momentum of a man who had stopped thinking. Earl pulled a flashlight from his belt and strode down the hallway toward the basement door. "Earl, stop!" Judith screamed. He didn't stop. He threw open the basement door, pounded down the stairs, and disappeared through the hole in the false wall that Claire and Garrett had broken open weeks ago. His flashlight beam bounced off the stone walls of the staircase as he descended into the sub-basement. Claire was already moving. She grabbed Garrett's arm and pulled him toward the front door. She grabbed Judith's sleeve. "We need to get out. Now." "What about the vault?" Garrett said. "The desk, Garrett. Rose's note. Do not open the desk drawers. There is no key. There is no safety." Understanding hit him like a physical blow. His face went white. Thorne was still standing in the parlor, frozen, caught between his desire for the ledgers and something he saw in Claire's expression that he didn't understand but couldn't ignore. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. "Your deputy just walked into a room with a 90-year-old phosphorus bomb, and he's going to try to open a desk that's rigged to ignite it." Thorne's composure shattered. He turned and ran for the basement door. "Earl, don't touch anything. Earl, stop." His voice echoed down the staircase, down the corridor, bouncing off the stone walls and the steel door that stood open at the end. He reached the top of the stone steps and started down. From deep beneath the house, from the vault at the bottom of the hidden staircase, came the sound of wood scraping against wood. The unmistakable sound of a desk drawer being forced open. Then a sharp mechanical snap. A metallic click that echoed through the underground space with the clarity of a gunshot. Then silence. Then hissing. A high-pitched, pressurized serpentine sound that rose from the depths of the earth like the exhalation of something that had been holding its breath for 91 years. Claire was at the front door. Garrett was behind her. Judith was beside her. The two council members had already fled to their vehicles, their doors slamming, their engines starting. "Thorne!" Claire shouted into the house. "Get out! Get out now!" She could hear Thorne on the basement stairs, his leather shoes slipping on the stone. She could hear him shouting Earl's name. She could hear the hissing growing louder, deeper, more insistent, as though the house itself was inhaling. Then the light came. It came from below. From the basement. From the sub-basement. From the vault. A light so white and so intense that it didn't illuminate so much as obliterate. It poured up the basement staircase like liquid, flooding the first-floor hallway with a brilliance that turned the walls translucent and cast shadows so sharp they looked cut from black paper. The heat followed the light by a fraction of a second. A wave of superheated air that blasted through the basement door and into the hallway, blistering the paint on the walls, cracking the plaster, and sending a shockwave of scorching wind through the parlor that knocked the lamps off the tables and shattered the glass in the front windows. Claire threw herself off the porch, pulling Garrett and Judith with her. They hit the overgrown lawn and rolled the damp grass, pressing against their faces as the heat passed over them like the breath of a furnace. From inside the house, from the basement, from deep underground, came a sound. Not an explosion. White phosphorus doesn't explode. It burns. It burns at 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt steel, hot enough to vaporize bone, hot enough to turn a room full of paper and wood and currency into ash in seconds. The sound was a roar. A sustained, thundering, inhuman roar, like a freight train passing through a tunnel made of stone. The ground beneath them trembled. Claire pressed her hands flat against the earth and felt the vibration, felt the heat radiating up through the soil from the inferno raging in the sub-basement below. "Earl!" Judith screamed, trying to stand, trying to go back toward the house. Claire grabbed her arm and held her down. "He's gone, Judith. There's nothing left to save." The roar continued for what felt like hours, but was probably 90 seconds. The white phosphorus consumed everything in the vault. The gold certificates, the wooden crates, the oak desk, the ledgers. Margaret Blackwood's remains. Everything that Silas Blackwood had hoarded and hidden and booby-trapped was being devoured by the very fire he had designed to protect it. The irony was perfect and terrible. Blackwood's final act of paranoia had done exactly what he intended. It had destroyed everything inside the vault. But it hadn't destroyed it to protect his secrets from outsiders. It had been triggered by the greed of the very people whose families he had terrorized. Earl Crane, great-grandson of a family that appeared in those ledgers as victims, had walked into the dead man's trap and pulled the trigger himself. Then Claire heard another sound. From the basement, a voice, weak, distorted by smoke, but human. Thorn. He had been on the stairs when the phosphorus ignited. Not in the vault itself, not in the direct path of the burn, but close enough to feel the heat, close enough to be seared by the superheated air that rushed up the stone corridor like a chimney flue. Claire stood up. The front of the house was intact. The windows were shattered. The paint on the hallway walls was bubbling, and thick gray smoke was pouring from the basement door. But the structure was standing. The stone foundation, the hand-cut masonry that had been laid in 1912 by craftsmen who built things to last, had contained the fire. The sub-basement was stone and steel. The fire had nowhere to go but up through the staircase, and the staircase opening was narrow enough to act as a bottleneck. The house above was damaged, but it was standing. "Stay here," Claire said to Garrett and Judith. "Claire, don't." She didn't listen. She pulled the collar of her shirt over her nose and mouth and went back inside. The smoke in the hallway was thick but breathable at floor level. She dropped to her hands and knees and crawled toward the basement door. Thorn was at the top of the basement stairs, collapsed against the wall. His silver hair was singed. His suit jacket was scorched, the fabric melted in patches against his skin. His face was red and blistered on the left side, the skin already swelling. His eyes were open, unfocused, streaming tears from the smoke. He was alive. Claire grabbed him under the arms and dragged him down the hallway across the parlor and out through the front door. He was heavier than she expected, dead weight, his legs trailing behind him, his shoes leaving black marks on the hardwood floor. She got him onto the porch and down the steps and onto the grass, and then she let go and fell to her knees, coughing, her lungs burning, her eyes watering. Garrett was there. He pulled her back away from the house into the cool night air. Judith was sitting on the ground, her arms wrapped around her knees, staring at the house with an expression of absolute emptiness. Smoke continued to pour from the shattered windows, but it was thinning. The fire below was consuming the last of its fuel. The phosphorus was burning itself out in the sealed stone chamber, devouring everything, and then, with nothing left to feed on dying, Claire lay on her back in the grass and looked up at the sky. The stars were out. More stars than she had ever seen in Portland. More stars than she had ever seen anywhere. The Milky Way stretched across the darkness like a river of light, indifferent and beautiful and ancient. She reached into her jacket pocket. Her fingers found what she already knew was there. 2 banded stacks of 1928 gold certificates, each stack containing 10 bills, $20,000 bills. $20,000 in rare historical currency, worth far more than face value to any collector or auction house. She had taken them from the open crate during her documentation session 2 nights ago. Not out of greed, out of the same instinct that had driven every decision she had made since arriving in Ashford Hollow. Preparation. The understanding that plans fail, that evidence can be destroyed, and that the only insurance worth having is the kind you keep close to your body. She kept them in her pocket. She said nothing. Sirens reached them 20 minutes later. The Ashford Hollow Volunteer Fire Department arrived, first 2 trucks with peeling paint and crews that looked like they had been roused from deep sleep. They approached the house cautiously, unreeling hoses setting up a perimeter. But they didn't rush. They didn't charge inside. They stood at a distance and watched the smoke thin and the house settle. And Claire understood that they had been expecting this. Maybe not tonight. Maybe not this way. But the possibility of the Blackwood house burning had lived in the collective imagination of Ashford Hollow for 91 years. They had always known it might end this way. The state police arrived 40 minutes after the fire department. 2 cruisers from the barracks in Elkins responding to a 911 call Claire had made from the lawn, while Garrett applied first aid to Thorne's burns with supplies from their car. Claire told the troopers everything. She showed them the cloud files on her phone. She showed them Rose's journal, which she had brought up from the vault during her documentation sessions and stored in a lockbox in the Honda Civic. She showed them the photographs of the ledgers, the vault Margaret Blackwood's remains, the room where Rose had been held. She told them about Emmett Marsh, the warehouse on Route 9, the cot, the locked door. The troopers dispatched a unit to the Millhaven property at once. They found Emmett Marsh at 1:17 in the morning, sitting on the cot in the concrete room, wearing his dark cardigan and his minister's collar, his hands folded in his lap. He was dehydrated and confused, but unharmed. When the trooper told him that Claire Whitfield had sent them, Emmett closed his eyes and said something the trooper later described as a prayer, though he couldn't make out the words. Colton Thorne was transported to the regional hospital in Elkins with second-degree burns on his face, neck, and left arm. He was placed under guard. By morning, a warrant had been issued for kidnapping, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and unlawful imprisonment. The charges would multiply in the weeks to come. Earl Crane's remains were recovered from the vault 11 days later after a hazmat team certified the site safe for entry. The phosphorus had burned at temperatures that reduced most of the vault's contents to calcium, white ash, and molten steel. The oak desk was gone. The crates were gone. The gold certificates, millions of dollars in rare currency, were nothing but a layer of fine gray powder on the scorched concrete floor. Earl's body was found near the desk. The coroner's report, delivered with clinical detachment, noted that the cause of death was consistent with exposure to white phosphorus combustion. There was no suffering in any conventional sense. The temperatures involved were beyond the threshold of human nervous response. He had ceased to exist before his brain could register pain. Claire read the report once and set it aside. She did not read it again. But the vault yielded one more secret. The forensic team, working slowly through the debris over the following weeks, recovered skeletal remains from 3 separate locations within the room. The first was Margaret Blackwood, whose remains Claire had already documented. The second and third were found beneath the concrete floor itself, in shallow excavations that had been covered over and sealed before the concrete was poured. 2 more women. 2 more sets of bones arranged in the same careful seated posture as Margaret. Silas Blackwood had not been a man who committed one act of violence. He had been a serial predator, a man who killed and concealed and continued using the vault as both his treasury and his graveyard. The ledgers, had they survived, might have contained the names. Without them, the identities of the 2 additional victims remained unknown, their stories erased by the same fire that destroyed their killers' records. But the DNA analysis conducted by the FBI's forensic laboratory over the course of several months eventually matched one set of remains to a missing persons report filed in 1929 by a family in neighboring Randolph County. A young woman named Ada Colvin, age 22, a school teacher who had disappeared while traveling to a job interview in Ashford Hollow. Her family had searched for years. They had written letters to every sheriff's office in the state. They had placed advertisements in newspapers. They had never stopped looking. Ada Colvin's great-niece, a retired nurse living in Morgantown, received the call from the FBI on a Tuesday afternoon. She was 81 years old. She sat in her kitchen and cried for an hour. Then she called her sister, and her sister called their cousin, and within a week, a family that had carried an unanswered question for nearly a century finally had its answer. It was not a happy answer, but it was an answer. And Claire had learned standing in the vault beneath the Blackwood house
that an answer, even a terrible one, was better than the silence.
The FBI's investigation expanded rapidly. Federal agents descended on Ashford Hollow with the quiet thoroughness of people who do this for a living. They interviewed every living resident over the age of 70. They subpoenaed county records going back to 1920. They examined Colton Thorne's personal finances and found a pattern of irregularities stretching back decades. Unexplained income shell companies, property transfers that didn't withstand scrutiny.
Claire's cloud files became the foundation of the federal case. The photographs of the ledgers, though the originals were destroyed, were accepted as documentary evidence. The detail was sufficient to reconstruct Blackwood's operation, to trace the money, to identify the overseer, and to establish a chain of complicity that ran from Wilton Thorne in 1920 to Colton Thorne in 2025.
The town of Ashford Hollow did not collapse.
Claire had been afraid it might, that the exposure of its founding sin would dissolve whatever bonds held the community together. But she underestimated the resilience of people who had been carrying a burden they never chose.
When the story broke first in the Charleston Gazette-Mail and then in the national press, the reaction in Ashford Hollow was not anger. It was relief. Quiet, exhausted, complicated relief. The kind that comes when you finally set down something you've been holding so long you forgot it was heavy. People talked. For the first time in 91 years, people talked. Old men who had heard the stories from their fathers sat on porches and told them again, but this time out loud, this time without looking over their shoulders. Women brought food to Claire's door, not because they approved of what she had done, but because feeding people was what you did when the world turned upside down, and bringing a casserole was easier than saying thank you, or I'm sorry, or both.
Lorene, the waitress at the diner, was the first to apologize. She came to the house on a Saturday morning with a pecan pie and a face full of something that looked like it had been trapped inside her for decades. "I should have told you," she said, "the day you walked in. I should have sat you down and told you everything." "You were afraid," Claire said. "I was a coward."
There's a difference between cowardice and survival, Lorene. This town has been surviving for 91 years. That's not nothing.
Lorene set the pie on the porch railing and wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Is it true what they're saying about Rose Marsh that she got out?" "Come inside," Claire said. "I'll tell you what the FBI found."
The FBI file on Rose Marsh arrived at 88 Briar Ridge Road on a Friday afternoon in late autumn, delivered by a field agent from the Charleston office who made the 4-hour drive personally because she said some things shouldn't be delivered by mail. The file was thin, 12 pages, but those 12 pages contained the ending of a story that had been waiting 91 years to be told. On the night of October 14th, 1934, when a group of men from Ashford Hollow dragged Silas Blackwood from his house and killed him in the snow, a 17-year-old coal miner named Thomas Garrett Oakes entered the house through the back door. He was not part of the group that killed Blackwood.
He was a boy who had been in love with Rose Marsh since the 7th grade and who had spent the past year trying to find her.
Thomas had heard the rumors. He had listened at doors. He had watched Blackwood's movements with the obsessive attention of a young man driven by something stronger than fear. He knew about the basement. He didn't know about the vault or the sub-basement, but he knew that Blackwood went below the house every morning and every evening carrying a tray of food and returned empty-handed. On the night Blackwood was dragged outside, Thomas Oakes went down to the basement. He found the false wall, which at that time was not yet sealed. He found the stone staircase. He found the corridor. He found the room with the iron bed and the chain. He found Rose. She was thin. She was weak. She had not seen sunlight in 365 days. But she was alive. And when Thomas Oakes knelt beside her and said her name, she looked at him with the same defiant eyes that stared out from the photograph in Emmett Marsh's shoebox, and she said, "Get me out of here." Thomas broke the chain with a crowbar. He carried Rose up the stairs through the basement and out the back door, while the men of Ashford Hollow were still standing over Blackwood's body in the front yard. He put her in his truck and drove east. He didn't stop until they reached the Virginia border. They never came back. Rose Marsh and Thomas Oakes were married in 1936 in a small courthouse ceremony in Roanoke, Virginia. They moved west slowly over the following years, settling eventually in a small town outside Billings, Montana. Rose took the name Rose Oakes. Thomas worked as a mechanic. They had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. They owned a modest house with a vegetable garden and a view of the Beartooth Mountains. Rose never told her children about Ashford Hollow. She never told them about the vault or the chain or the year she spent underground. Thomas never told them either. It was a silence they carried together, not out of shame, but out of a mutual understanding that some things belong to the people who survived them and no one else. Rose Marsh Oakes died on March 7, 1987, at the age of 71. Pancreatic cancer. Thomas held her hand in the hospital room in Billings while their children stood around the bed. Her last words, according to her eldest daughter, were, "Open the window. I want to see the sky." Thomas died 4 years later. They were buried side by side in a cemetery outside Billings under a headstone that read simply, "Together." Claire read the file sitting on the front porch of 88 Briar Ridge Road. The mountains rose around the valley red and gold with autumn. The weeping willows had dropped their leaves, standing bare and skeletal in the yard, and the house behind her was quiet, its wounds slowly healing under new paint and fresh plaster, and the patient attention of 2 people who had decided to stay. She read the last page and closed the folder. She sat for a long time looking at the mountains, feeling the cool air on her face, listening to the silence that was no longer oppressive, but simply still. Then she stood up and drove into town. Emmett Marsh was sitting on the porch of his cottage behind First Methodist Church. He was wearing his dark cardigan and a new pair of wire-rimmed glasses, identical to the ones Claire had found on the church steps. He had a blanket over his knees, and he was drinking coffee from a white ceramic mug. He was 95 years old. He had lived his entire life with a question that had no answer. A sister who had vanished into the dark when he was 3. A family that had grieved in silence. A mother who had kept a pressed wildflower in her Bible because it was the only piece of her daughter she had left. Claire sat down beside him. She handed him the FBI file. "Read it," she said. He read it. His hands trembled. His coffee went cold. The pages rustled in the autumn breeze, and twice he had to set the folder down and remove his glasses and press his fingers against his eyes. When he finished, he was quiet for a very long time. "She saw the sky," he said finally. "She saw the sky," Claire said. "She saw the mountains. She had children. She had a garden. She lived, Emmett. She lived 53 years after that room. She had a whole life." Emmett Marsh closed the folder. He held it against his chest the way Claire had held Rose's journal the first time she read it, pressing it close, as though the paper might transmit something that words could not. "Thomas Oakes," he said. "I remember that name. He was a boy in the valley. Skinny kid. Used to bring wildflowers to our house and leave them on the porch when he thought nobody was looking." He smiled. It was a smile so full of grief and joy and the strange, terrible beauty of a story that took 91 years to find its ending, that Claire had to look away. "He brought her flowers," Emmett said. "And then he brought her home." Claire left the old man on his porch with the folder and the coffee and the autumn light. She drove back to Briar Ridge Road, where Garrett was on the front porch, sanding the railing, working with the patient concentration of a man who had found something worth the labor. She went inside. She walked to the parlor, to the wall beside the stone fireplace, where she had hung a framed photograph 3 days ago. Rose Marsh, 17 years old, dark hair, defiant eyes. The photograph from Emmett's shoebox enlarged and printed on archival paper, mounted in a simple oak frame that Garrett had built from salvaged wood found in the attic. Claire stood in front of the photograph. She reached out and straightened the frame, adjusting it by a fraction of an inch, the way you adjust something that matters. This woman, this girl, chained to a wall in the dark, with no hope of rescue, no reason to believe anyone would ever find her, had reached through a gap beneath a steel door with a piece of wire from her own bed and bent a striker arm 1/4 of an inch. She couldn't save herself. She couldn't escape. She couldn't even know if her sabotage would work. But she did it anyway, because she understood something that Silas Blackwood, with all his money and all his leverage and all his paranoia, had never understood. That the future belongs to the people who believe someone is coming. Rose Marsh had believed. 91 years before Claire Whitfield stood in front of that vault door, a 17-year-old girl in chains
had believed that someone someday would stand where Claire was standing, and she had given that stranger a chance. Claire pressed her palm flat against the wall of the house. The plaster was smooth and cool under her hand. Beneath it, the old growth framing. Beneath that, the hand-cut stone. Beneath that, the earth.
The house was standing, damaged, scarred, carrying the weight of everything that had happened within its walls and beneath its floors. But standing, the way Rose had stood, the way Emmett had stood, the way Claire was standing now. She heard Garrett's footsteps on the porch. The rhythmic scrape of sandpaper resumed. Outside, the mountains held the valley in their ancient hands, and the sky above Ashford Hollow was wide and clear and full of the kind of light that comes after a long darkness.
Claire turned from the photograph. She walked to the front door, opened it, and stepped outside into the morning. The cheapest house in the state had cost $12,800. It had nearly cost them their lives, but it had given them something no amount of money could buy. A home built on the truth. And in the parlor on the wall beside the fireplace, Rose Marsh looked out from her oak frame with those steady, defiant eyes, watching over the house she had saved, keeping her vigil patient and unbroken the way she always had.